she's doing okay.
And testing's hard anyway with that extra pressure.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
We are recording.
I do. I thought we were recording a second ago.
So you have to go to work.
Dang.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we're meeting, you know, Charlotte's dressed up for
We are
it.
recording.
Okay. And we start early?
That clock is losing time again. So actually, it is 6 up.
Oh, is it? It's okay. Go ahead and start.
According to all the rest of this is 6.
Okay. All right. Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting to order. I want to welcome everyone to this evening's City Council study session. Our first agenda item is Board and Commission reappointment discussion. And City Manager Eric Keck is here to discuss the Board and Commission reappointments.
Thank you, Mayor and members of Council. The information that you have in your packet pretty much sums it up. Again, as is the custom, that's kind of live there, Sam. As is the custom, the information for those who wish to desire to continue with their service to the city have been enunciated within this memorandum. And so what you have before you tonight is a listing of those who desire to seek reappointment, and you have some summary information related to that also from some of the chairpersons as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but mainly this should be a fairly short discussion amongst council members as to the direction to give to staff on how you want to see this proceed. Given the fact that during the discussion of our policy manual, I know one of the things that we wanted to recirculate back was whether or not the council wanted to re-interview those who had previously been appointed. But as reappointments, there was a desire for some folks to actually interview those who were seeking reappointment. So we are happy to take direction and put together the appropriate systems to facilitate whatever the council would like with this proposed reappointment process.
Okay, with that, does anyone, do we want to continue doing it the way we have been doing it as far as the reappointment, or any other suggestions? Councilmember Wink.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. For the sake of time and timeliness, I guess, I would be in favor of continuing the way we have been doing it, and then with our rollout of our new policy and procedures, a newer process for boards and commission is a part of that and rolls out with that.
Okay, great.
Just for a point of information, could you explain what you understand the current way that we're doing it that you want to maintain is, so that we have some clarification on how we're doing it? Councilmember Wink.
I'm referring to the specific point of having members who are reapplying go through the application process or the interview process again. I think we don't need to
go through the interview process again. Is that what you're saying?
That's what we were talking about. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, right now.
Okay.
I don't know if I love the idea for the future, but at least for now, if we're going to make that change, I would want to do it a little later.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Councilmember Martinez.
I would agree with that also. I don't think it's necessary to interview them again for their reapplication.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts?
I don't think it's necessary for them to re-interview, but I am not in favor of the way that we currently do it either.
Okay, right. And so that...
There's more to it than that, so...
Right. And I do think that it will come up in the policy discussion again because it is on the agenda for that. Any other thoughts? Okay.
All right.
Thank you. That answers, I think, all the questions that we need, yes.
Okay, thank you. And moving on to agenda item 2, March financials, finance and administrative.
Well, hold on a second. I thought we were talking about the reappointments that we got here.
Do we need to? Do we talk about those, or do we just go ahead and reappoint?
If we have sufficient everything in place with what we've required for reappointment to this date, then I think there's nothing different then, correct? If we have the letters from the chairs and the supporting documentation about attendance, I think is what we've used for our criteria. So if we have, then it seems at a fast glance that we do have that here.
Okay. All right. Thank
Maybe
you.
we should vote for it.
Councilmember Berntine.
Well, then I'll bring it up again. I wanted to discuss the process that we think we currently have now, since it's not really a written down
Okay.
process or policy. So what is it we're doing?
Okay, so what is it that you want to, do you want to discuss?
Well, if we're just moving forward, are we just going ahead and taking the reappointments as they are as a consensus to move forward to come up for a vote? They still have to come up for a vote, so.
So will they come up for a vote at the next council meeting, the reappointments?
During the process is to bring forth resolution that would appoint all of them again, or reappoint them, excuse me. And at that point in time, if council wanted to have discussion about an individual, you could at that time. I'm not certain it's the next meeting, however, but have to look at our schedule for when those resolutions might be ready to be brought forward.
Okay, but that comes up separate from the other
Correct.
appointments.
Yeah, your normal appointment process is obviously different because we're still that process is still open and receiving applications for any vacancies that might exist for you to interview those individuals and then determine where to place them if there are openings or as openings exist.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Olson.
I think typically what we have done is looked at this and kind of given a consensus of are we okay with putting all these forward, and if we have any problem with any particular one of them, which usually we haven't, we just go forward and we vote in there.
Okay.
So I'm fine with saying that at this point, unless we have some other criteria that we're going to use that they meet the requirements that we've set forth already.
Okay.
Just one other, make sure that with the city attorney, all of the boards and commissions have gone over their bylaws and had an opportunity to go to the training for the Bob's Rules.
They've all had an opportunity to go to the training. I've worked with 3 of them on redoing their bylaws, but I can't tell you that all of them have reviewed their bylaws. I don't know that that is true.
Okay. Then maybe I can ask the assistant city manager if all of the boards and commissions have had an opportunity to make sure that they're in compliance.
Councilmember Barrington, you might want to use the microphone.
That they're in compliance with their bylaws and the charter. I mean, since that's what we've been pushing for, and we're getting ready to do a new set, and then people are going to be doing their new chairs and everything, so everybody's had a chance to.
At the training, our direction for boards and commissions was to review their bylaws, especially as it related to the rules of procedure, so that if they had something that defined whether or not they were using Robert's Rules of Order or not, if so, to memorialize the use of Bob's Rules of Order. I can't verify whether each of the boards or commissions has had the chance to do that. I think those where there were some process concerns or they were just on top of it, they're the ones that we've worked with so far.
But by now, I mean, they all know that they have bylaws, whether they have them or not, and that they are required to work under the charter and their bylaws and the municipal code.
They should know that. Yes.
Awesome. In that case, I don't have anything further. I guess we just go forward.
Okay, so, and we just, right now we have consensus to move forward reappointing all of the applicants. Is that?
As indicated within the council communication, yeah, I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so now we can move on to the next agenda item. March financials. Finance and Administrative Services Director Kathleen Rinkel is here to discuss the March 2018 financial report. Good evening.
Good evening. So I'm happy to say that we're in a good position. We're only a quarter of the way through the year, so we're still cautiously optimistic at this point. The year-to-date revenues through March are exceed the expenditures by a little over $2.4 million, and the year-to-date revenues are better than the budget by 26.5%, and we're 25% through the year. So that's pretty good. And we're better than we were last year at this time by about $1.2 million. The expenditures are lower than budgeted, and we're only at 21.5 spent versus 25% of the year gone. And last year we were at 24.3. So feeling pretty good about these. First page is a summary, and it walks through the beginning balance that we started with at the beginning of this year and where we are with year-to-date revenues and year-to-date expenses to come to an estimated year-to-date ending balance. Now, this isn't where we'll end up because we do have some more expenditures and revenues, and some are front-loaded, some are end-loaded, but at this point we're positive in all areas. On the second page, you can clearly see with the little red and blue bar in March that our revenues are exceeding our expenses. And then on page 3, I'd like to focus on the expenditures at the bottom where we've got them by department. And each one you can see is below the 25% year mark. Except for Public Works, and that's just because they had a little bit of front loading on some of their benefits and so forth, which will smooth forward with the rest of the year. Page 4 you've seen before, so I won't walk through that one. The numbers have not changed. And then page 5 gives you the same information we looked at on page 3 with some added history of 2017 and 2016. With some additional fund balance analysis at the bottom. On page 7, I'd like to point out that we've got 2 areas that are very strong in growth over where they've been in the past several years, and that's Area 3 and Area 5. Area 7 appears to be lower, but we broke off part of that, and that's now Area 14. That's our internet sales.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Is Area 3 and Area 5 where the marijuana stores happen to be, or is that why it is better?
I would have to do some research. I didn't bring that information with me. I do know that Area 5, Councilmember Cuesta had asked for a little information on the businesses that had come in and left, and the one business that left was Kmart, but we had 2 businesses come in, and one was CPJM Spa Company and Eaton Sales and Service LLC. So that would be Area 5 changes.
Okay.
The marijuana stores I'll have to look into, and I can bring that next time.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me. If you're going to do that, can we just get kind of a synopsis of how they've done since we've...
How the marijuana stores have done?
Both the medical since 2009 and then as it's come in to retail.
Okay.
Councilmember Berentine, would you please move the microphone closer so we can hear better? Thank you.
Did you hear me okay, though?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
On page 8, I would like to have you look at column labeled 2018 for the different areas. And I'd like to point out that in Area 7, it appears to have dropped by 3%, but if you add Area 14 to it, which we broke out separately so you could separately identify, we're really only down 0.66%, which is a little bit over $18,000. So still fairly strong in that area. Those are pretty much the highlights. Any questions?
Are there any questions for Ms. Rinkel? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item is Council Policy Manual discussion. Assistant City Manager Mark Woulf is here to review the Council Policy Manual with us. Good evening again.
Good evening. All right, so I am picking up where we left off last time with our policy manual discussion. Quick recap, you have adopted a procedure manual, so congratulations on that. You'll have to have a little bit of a discussion as to when that takes full effect, and I would imagine that it is in line with whenever you get this policy manual moved along. But that's one note there, so check on the procedure manual. You have provided us several recommended additions or revisions so far. We are compiling those, and we'll continue to compile them tonight and bring back a final draft for you at a later date. This presentation adds a few items that you've requested over the last several meetings when we've discussed the policy manual towards the end of the presentation. including off-agenda topics, the role of the chairperson, so the mayor or the mayor pro tem, rules of decorum, packet printing and distribution, and the role of council liaison as it relates to boards and commissions. And I heard one this evening, perhaps, is to talk about appointments to boards and commissions and whether or not to make any alterations to that in the future. So, jumping right into where we left off, items, again, this section is items that are not currently addressed in your draft. So if you'd like this to be included, any of the following items included in the draft, let us know, and with that consensus, we can draft a policy that would be included in the final draft. This item is related to council requests. This is borrowed from another city. I forget at this point which one. A few of them have them. Essentially, this is to avoid any type of request that would require an inordinate amount of staff time. And I think we've had a very positive relationships in terms of council requests. I think at times there are requests where it does require a substantial amount of staff time. And so I think in those cases, especially if it's may or may not be related to something that will eventually come as a policy decision to council, that there's some thought behind those requests that will take a lot of staff time, especially as they stack up. Maybe there's 4 or 5 in the same meeting. And so this, again, would be used very sparingly, we hope, but to ask for what we're calling here a minimum consensus for any council requests. Again, most of the time, probably 99 out of 100 times, just write down the council request and take it as is. But in those cases, we'd have a mechanism to ask if there was minimum consensus for those types of requests.
Councilmember Wink.
Thank you. So would you like us to give you our consensus at this moment?
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Or our decision?
Yes.
Feedback. I think this is very rational. Time is money, and I think we all know what's on the plate of the city manager. So I think allowing that opportunity to garner minimum consensus is perfectly reasonable. So I'm in favor of it as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Martinez.
Thank you. I'm also in favor of it, and I wonder at some times if you know right away when the council request is made that it will take a long time, or how much work it will be, or if sometimes after the fact, you determine that it would take a long time, and you would need to come back to council and ask for consensus. Is that how we would do that?
I think for the most part, we'll try to handle it at the time. Some of the times, I would say most of the time, we won't need to use it. I would say there's a number of requests that we've provided a lot of information in the past, so it was a lot of staff work at some time, but not to compile previous information. I think there's some, especially the larger requests where we know it's going back many years, to ask if that information would be valuable to a minimum consensus of council before we move forward.
Okay. Councilmember Berentine.
I'm just a little confused by intended to be utilized sparingly by the city manager, because it's not the city manager who would call for the 3 members, would it?
It would be my intention that if a request does come forward, and it does seem to be onerous, I'm going to say council understand that this might take a significant amount of time. Is there consensus with at least 3 members to fulfill that request? So,
but that's pretty much what we do already. I mean, that's what we've always done. I don't think we've. I don't know. I'm not sure that it needs to be in the policy manual. We do it anyway, but I don't care. I mean, there's nothing. If you've got frivolous or excessive, intensive requests, then it's been because the majority of council wanted it done already. That's what's been happening already. So as opposed to put it down, that's fine. And you've always had the opportunity to go, hey, this is going to take a lot. You've said that numerous times. So, and I don't think as a council or as, I mean, you're pretty professional about it. I mean,
sure. I
don't think you've let any frivolous stuff go through to sit there and go, hey, yeah, you're wasting everybody's time, but that's cool.
I would not
so,
say that.
But if it helps to put it in there, makes people feel better. I mean, it's just the same thing we were already doing, so I'm good with that. I just want to make sure that it's not necessary, that it's a partnership. I kind of just was confused by intended to be used sparingly, like all of a sudden he calls for some vote or something. It worked really well just having conversations.
Sure. No, and I think that would continue, Member Valentine, yeah,
all right.
sure.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Thank you. Councilmember Olson.
I like this. I think it's important to protect the manager and give you some very specific outs. It doesn't say a consensus. It doesn't it's not a vote. It must not be because it's only 3 members. It's not even a majority. It's just 3 people really do want this. I do think that there have been times we've asked you to do some things that were probably not not the best use of your time. So I like that it's in here. I think it's some good guidelines, and then we don't have to fight over it. And I think the reason you put it sparingly is, I'm sure to tell us that you don't think there's a whole lot of this going on. That's why it's more of a making sure we know this isn't something you want to be doing every single time, which is fine with me.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Bernstein.
I just want I think that's unfair to the city manager, just this kind of like we're protecting him. I don't think we're protecting him from council or the citizens, so I don't want to give that impression. He doesn't need protection. He does pretty good. So that kind of idea of it is bothersome to me, but the way that it's written, I think, is fine. I mean, and I think that's what we're doing already. So,
right.
However, if the city manager ever does think he needs protection, then I'm sure he'll bring it to council.
All right. So, okay. So we have consensus. We can move forward with that.
Thank you. All right, moving right along. So these next few items should be fairly straightforward. These are all items that you've heard about a bit in the past. Once all the way back with your city attorney in this council's orientation, and again with Attorney Bob Widener in talking through a few of these items. Each of the following 3 policies, they don't necessarily. Well, I'll put it this way. Just because the policy isn't addressed in your manual does not mean it doesn't apply to you as an elected official. To be clear, liability is created. Individual liability can be created in a number of these different scenarios, which you've had explained at length. I think where these policies come into play, and Attorney Brown can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, is it sets some expectations in this group as to what rules you will follow, and also for the public. So where they may be restrictions or rules, so to speak, for elected officials in general, having them as a part of your own policy manual helps set those expectations at the outset. So starting with executive session privilege, setting the expectation that matters discussed within those executive sessions stay within the confines of those topics. And again, the reminder here is that the liability can be created with or without this policy if your fiduciary responsibility is kind of violated by anything discussed in executive session. So that's number 1, and I can take all 3 or just one at a time if that's helpful.
Okay, so all 3 are one, meaning not the litigation and pre-litigation. Is that also included in that?
Yeah, each of the following 3. So maybe one at a time is helpful. Okay,
so executive session privilege. Do you want to address anything before we about that?
Yes. I worry sometimes that the inherent conflict between protecting the fiduciary interests of the city and being transparent is not recognized by all the members of the staff, all the members of the council, and all the members of the community. The goal is to be as transparent as possible unless there's something that can harm the city. A good example of that, although not the only one, the good example of that is personnel matters cannot be discussed in open session. And if they are discussed in open session, there is harm
that could potentially come to the city. So those are things, no matter how interested people are in what's happening with personnel, we cannot discuss that in open session. Land transactions, if people were aware of how much the city council were willing to spend on land, that's where the price would start. So there are areas that this council has to deal with, and until the matter is concluded in some cases and maybe forever in others, it can't be made public. And while all of that is set forth under the law, I like the idea of having this in the policy manual because it's a really quick reference to let everybody remind themselves of what these rules are. It protects the council members, and I think it helps the community to understand the choices the council members sometimes have to make that they don't like making. So that's why I'm in favor of having these three here. Even if they're not here, the council would be bound, but it would be on me to remind you every time one of these issues came up. Remember, you can't speak about that. I think that gets unwieldy and becomes rather unprofessional, so I like the idea they're just written down and people are aware of what they are.
Thank you. Councilmember Barentine?
Could you, so are we doing all three of them together then?
We can.
Okay. Avoid taking actions which create liability for the city, just that portion of it, since there's an or there. What do you mean by that?
That's actually pretty much right out of the state law. And an example of that would be discussing matters associated with personnel in public. Since we are all aware that if you discuss matters associated with personnel, I mean, you've heard me chant this, in open session, that there could be harm to an individual's reputation, which could harm their ability to find employment away from the city. Therefore, you just can't discuss those things, and it creates liability when it's discussed in public. Does it make us always comfortable? There are things that happen with personnel that the whole community's interested in on occasion, but it doesn't matter how interested the community is to protect the fiduciary interests of the city. It just can't be discussed in open session. So that's an example, but I'm sure that there's broader example. I mean, there's certainly more than that. I just think that's the easiest one.
But it wouldn't include, I mean, our responsibility to the community. I mean, because the way that everything is kind of written is like that it's protecting the city, and my bosses are the constituency, and sometimes the city is at odds with something that the constituency believes that they're doing, and so that doesn't. So if I knew that the city did something illegal or harmful, I have an obligation to make sure that I'm forthright with that. Whether that creates liability or not for the city is the city's kind of problem. So I think that's come up this last couple of years. And so if I was aware, I'm not saying that there is, but if I was aware of that, then I would be honest.
If I was aware that the city had done anything illegal, I would be contacting the right law enforcement officers to begin investigation. That's not what we're talking about.
All right. So as long as we're on the same page with that, because the way everything, when we start talking about this stuff, is that we're protecting the city manager, we're protecting the city. We want to make sure that, that we don't get sued, and it just kind of ends up being talked about that way because of the nature of what we're doing. So I just wanted to make sure to put that out there. That is not the case, that none of this is crafted to go ahead and protect the city against the citizens or any issue that would come up where the city would be in the wrong, that we would always be as upfront and open as possible and follow the law. So that's not what any of this is being crafted for. That's all I just wanted to make clear. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Wink?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I'm in favor of the language under executive session privilege, litigation and pre-litigation, and personnel matters as it's stated here tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Should it say litigation and pre-litigation?
In the policy manual?
Yeah, the next slide.
Oh, she's talking about number 3. Okay,
Yeah.
never mind.
Okay. All right, I am okay with it. Any other discussion? Councilmember Olson.
I think all three of these make sense. This is how we should be acting. And if there's anybody determining that the city has done something illegal, I would look to our attorney to be the one who advises us on that, not anyone else, unless we had an outside counsel that was legitimized as an attorney to make a ruling of the same. So I hope that we all agree with that not any one of us here is one to be able to judge whether or not it would stand in the court of law or not. So I think this helps to make it clear.
No, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think we're each elected to
order.
represent.
Point of order, please put your...
I think we're all elected to represent people, so I don't read it that way. That's why I made the clarification that I did. So no, I don't agree. I don't agree to that. If any one of the 7 of us truly believe that this city had violated the law, then they have an obligation to make sure that they bring it to this council. And I don't.
That's not a.
Is that not Councilmember Olson? Go ahead.
We're talking about talking with other people about it and speaking from to the public about it. I think here, if I thought something was illegal, I would certainly come to our city attorney, and if I didn't feel like I got the correct kind of response that I thought was still not, I would take it to another kind of matter. I mean, I would look for another attorney's opinion, I would think, or I would ask for some kind of resolution.
Right.
And perhaps I would ask the city attorney, well, let's think about this for a minute. So how would you want us to handle that? If we came to you and said, I think what we're doing here is illegal, and you said, no, you absolutely have the legal right to do that, and I disagree with you, what's my next option? Would it be then to ask you to then convene all of us in executive session? Or what would be the next stage so that we did have process?
First thing is, if any city council member thinks that something illegal is happening, the city manager and I would want to meet with the council in executive session. And for all the people out there listening, that has never happened.
Right.
But if it were to happen, of course we'd all want to meet in executive session and discuss that, because that's a really serious concern. I've never been in the position where a council member's brought something. If something has happened along those lines, it tends to be discovered at the department level and dealt with very quickly by the administration. But if that should happen, that's of course where we want to go. The problem is, and this was how Bob Widener was explaining it when he came, and so it's easier to use his words. The problem is that once you are elected, you're no longer candidates for a position. You are a body. You are a corporate body. And what that means is that you have a fiduciary responsibility to the corporate body. And there are times when you are going to be told things by me or by the city manager that, if they became public knowledge, would harm the corporate body. And under the Colorado state law, you have a fiduciary responsibility to protect this corporate body. You are all members of it. That's really a mental leap for people. I think you guys have all been doing this long enough. You're all pretty confident with that role. But for the first few months anyone's on council, or for anybody who's thinking about running for council, or even members of the community, it's hard to separate the candidate from the person who's elected and becomes a member of a corporate body, and the fiduciary responsibilities placed on them for that role. I don't think these are being placed in here so that we can cover up illegal activities. I have to tell you, illegal activities don't get to happen with a governmental entity, because if they do, the governmental entity fails. We all, as employees and as elected officials and even as members of the community, have a duty to monitor that type of thing and make sure the world is aware of it. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about
land sales, what kind of prices we're wanting to deal with, contracts, and what the implications are of making determinations about how we're going to interpret lines within a contract, or again, personnel issues. We're talking about those kind of things that, if the public was aware of the decision, could create financial harm. And as protectors of the community's financial best interest, you don't want to take steps that are going to cause the city to have to figure out where they're going to get money to pay off for liabilities. So that's what we're looking at.
Okay, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I am absolutely fine with these.
Okay.
The reason that I asked was because that's not how it was used previously. So if you have people like what happened with the water sludge come forward, it's the citizens coming forward and saying, I believe that there's a violation here. And then we have somebody substantiate that Powell should have been covered. That's the state law. Powell should have been covered. We were not following the law. And then having ever saying that again, well, in that particular instance, in covering up that sludge pile, we were not following the law for a period of time. That's just the reality of it. But to ever say that again, that somehow that's a violation of this, is that how you would read it?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, then I guess you answered my question as well. Thanks.
Okay, so we do have consensus then to include this language. Okay.
Great. All right, so we covered those three. We will add those within the revised manual. All right. So, revisiting a few items. This is one slide, but I know there's a lot to unpack within this particular slide, but we will try. So, first thing is revisiting off-agenda topics. So, as a reminder, and I know the page numbers are different, but on the draft I have at the bottom of page 13 of your current draft.
Just a second. What about the personnel matters?
I was including that.
That was one of the three we just said yes to.
I thought executive privilege. Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Fine.
Yeah, it calls out personnel matters.
Okay, there were two of them on the
separately.
first one. Okay.
From which one? I thought we were doing executive session, taking action for liability, and the litigation and pre-litigation.
That's what I actually thought too.
That's what we were doing.
So personnel matters.
The three I named were the three of the same header, which
Okay.
yeah, executive session, right? The pre-litigation, litigation, and then personnel matters, because they were equally weighted and items under that section.
No, then we'll need to go through that third one, because that's not how I understood it.
And actually, I didn't. Now I see that it was that way. That there were 2 points under executive session privilege, but I didn't necessarily understand it that way. I mean, I'm okay with in the context of what we just discussed, putting it in there. The one thing that I want to make certain here is that I think sometimes council does need to be aware of personnel matters. I'm not saying that it needs to be open to the public, but I think perhaps sometimes there's things that we need to know. But it's not cover. We will still know those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In executive session.
Right. Okay. That's all I'm asking.
Yes.
So, okay. Councilmember Berentine?
And then I think some of this got skewed from some comments people made, that bringing up any employee or any issue that's going on with an employee is bringing up a personnel matter. Can we define personnel matter better? Because we have citizens that come and bring up code enforcement supervisor or something going on with the defense, and something happened at, community development or police officer. And I don't see that as a personnel matter. So if we can define that, then I can wrap my head around whether I agree with this or not.
A personnel matter is a matter that involves an individual's employment or employment status. Some of the things that you described have to do with events happening within the community, and employees responded to those events. Whether or not the employees need to be called out by name or not, that's a discussion that you've been having the last several meetings. But discussing things that have happened within the community and the fact that employees have been involved is different from discussing an employee's employment status. I do encourage you, if you discuss an employee in public, to avoid saying anything derogatory or that can in any way be used against the employee, because keep in mind, public employment is very different from private employment. Private employees of private companies, can be disciplined, they can have personnel files created, but when they move to another private company, that information stays absolutely private. Under CORA, nothing about a public employee, well, that's not true, but very little about a public employee stays private. So not only can people's personnel files get pulled up, or elements of people's personnel files, but you can also go back through any meeting and listen to see at times when a public official might have said something negative about an employee. And what that makes it very hard is for a public employee to move forward in their careers. So I'm going to encourage you to always be very careful about what you say about employees, but that's not what we're talking about for personnel matters.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, the employees understand that anybody who's paid by the taxpayers, it's open and public, and that the public has a right to know, and so that does put them at some additional exposure, but that's by the nature of the position that they have taken, by who's paying them. So, yeah, that it answered my question, that it's different.
Okay.
Personnel matters and bringing up an employee, especially when there's issues that the public has, are different.
So are you okay with
I am. The way that
it?
she's described personnel matters, yes.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Olson.
I just want to make sure that I understand that this is for us. This is not for the citizens. Citizens can say things, and they will say things, although I would prefer that the presiding officer actually interrupt them if they're going to be derogatory, because I don't believe that that's helpful. But, of course, we can disagree on that. But this is about us not doing this to our employees when we're in there or here in a way that could be violating their own right to speak for themselves, and could be misrepresenting them, could be putting it in a light. I mean, I've seen that happen here, which really disturbs me.
This is about elected officials who are on television making statements about employees' employment status that can harm an individual's future. And then whether or not they agree, whether or not all the information is out there, an individual's reputation can be ruined. And a regular employer, if they have something negative to say about an employee, they're not on television announcing it to the entire community. So there is a possibility, and I've discussed this with you in other sessions, there's a possibility of liability for making it difficult for an individual to move forward in their employment. And that's the reason I want this in here is, yes, I want to protect employees, but that's not my number one goal. My number one goal is to protect you as a body, as a corporate body, because by protecting you, I protect the city. So that's what I'm interested in.
So it is, sorry if I cut you off. It's mostly about employment status. It wouldn't be about an employee's performance, whether they did something well or not, from our opinion.
Most of the time, not. I'm sure that I could come up with examples where I sit on the city council and I say, Joe Jones is just a failure as an employee. Mr. City Manager, I can't believe you keep him on the payroll. Every time I turn around, I'm hearing something negative about Joe Jones. I think that is a problem. So I'm just asking all of you to be very careful about how you speak about employees in public, because everything you say is publicized.
Thank you.
I think from the management side of things, if an employee did something wrong or mishandled an issue, instead of speaking directly about that employment, we absolutely want to know that issue. And if the employee did do something incorrectly, we'd like to know about it and address it directly with that employee. And if it becomes at that point some type of disciplinary matter with the employee, that's the type of thing that we don't want or can't have out in the public. And so I think what we're trying to say is that we're not deterring issues being brought to us. We absolutely want to know those issues, but we want to be able to kind of keep the employee's name as best we can out of the public realm and deal with that on a case-by-case basis as we need to.
Well, and the truth is, that scenario that you just described, the truth is it would be better if we came individually to the city manager and shared that with the city manager rather than in public. I mean, I see that as protected by this. Councilmember Barentine?
I think that the same thing happens, though, City Attorney, when we talk about a department as well. I mean, it's kind of between a rock and a hard spot. So if we have people who have a problem with something and we kind of look as if we're just protecting, how great everybody is and everything's fine, and they all work very hard, and they do. I mean, they do. But no organization is perfect. And then it kind of looks like we're sticking our head in the sand and just going, we don't like anybody coming to complain about them, and we're not supposed to say anything either. Then everything is being done in private, and I think that's actually kind of more unfair. So the transparency piece of it then becomes part of an issue. Some of these personnel, I mean, if that's why I wanted to separate it out from personnel. If people are going to come and complain about certain departments, you already have certain people that are already looking as if that's part of they're going to take that personally, that that's their job, or they're the director, they're the supervisor, or they're in charge of that permit or whatever it was. So, and we can't shut our citizens up, and we don't want to chide them for coming and telling us where we have room for improvement and where issues are going. So I think sometimes they get frustrated because if we're just going to sit there and say we're all great and they're all hardworking and that's mean, it doesn't fix anything. So would you think that is the same issue if a department is talked about? Because you have very specific people that are attached to certain departments too. So I don't know. If I was them, I'd rather know what the problems were, have it out in the open, and be able to fix them and resolve issues than having the kind of swell of frustration and problems where people keep coming back because they don't think we're addressing things. So I think some of that's going to happen to a certain extent.
Okay. Thank you. City Attorney?
There's no way to deal with every possible outcome or every possible fact pattern that might come before the City Council. One of the things that's interesting to me about this city's charter is Section 32, which says that council shall deal with the administrative service solely and directly through the city manager, and neither the council, its members, nor committee shall either dictate the appointment or direct or interfere with the work of any officer or employee under the city manager, either publicly or privately. Attempted dictation, direction, or interference on the part of any member of the council shall be deemed misconduct. The only place in the charter that refers to council member misconduct has to do with personnel. And I don't think that's in there by mistake. I think that historically the one place that council has to be incredibly careful to protect the fiduciary interest of the city as a whole is with personnel. And so I agree, there may be a time when, and I can certainly see, when one of the council members wants to say, I've just been so frustrated with the city attorney's office because whatever. But that's not saying we don't like one of the members of the staff or whatever. That's not discussing an individual. That's discussing performance of a department. We take that down, we take it back, we try to deal with the department. I do see that as different than dealing with an individual. But again, how you want to include that in your council member policy certainly comes back to you. but when I looked at this, I was really trying to think of a way to best protect this corporate body.
Thank you. Councilmember Olson.
That was helpful. I just want to reiterate to make sure that I understand this is not limiting in any way what citizens come up and say. We could decide, however, that we want to have a little bit more decorum in there in particular in the way that we deal with one another, especially when people are called out, and we sometimes pile on to that, and I find that to be unhelpful. But this really is about how we act. It doesn't limit the citizens and their complaints and their coming forward. I don't believe that our work, at least in the regular meetings, is about problem solving for every citizen complaint that comes up, but to direct it in the right way. We are not the city manager. The city manager is in charge of the employees and should be dealing with personnel matters. We ought to be bringing to Manager Keck, when we do see something or we hear continuous complaints for something, we should be bringing it to you. If not individually, I would hope individually to begin with so that he has a chance to respond. And then if it becomes a problem that all of us see with, certainly we could talk about, the space department that wants to launch another satellite and how dumb we think that is and that's a waste of money. I mean, of course we can talk about some departments where we feel like have gotten off track. It doesn't mean that we talk about personnel. That's what this is about, right?
Yes.
Okay. And the truth is, if it ends up involving personnel in the department, that's something that we would probably want to have an executive session to discuss together as a council.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I would only disagree with your suggestion and what Councilmember Olson has said, that we start going to the city manager individually about those kind of things. Without the rest of the corporate body being aware of what the issues are and what's going on and possible direction that we're taking, then you're setting people up to go ahead and start directing individually our city manager to take action, and I disagree with that.
Okay.
Just to clarify, that is not what I'm talking about. I have brought concerns to you when I've heard them, so points of information. I don't direct Manager Keck to do anything. I explain. Hopefully you've got the professional skills to say, you know what, thank you, that's helpful, move on. I think that's the way our complaints ought to be dealt with when it comes to any particular personnel. To bring it up in here about a specific person is absolutely, I think, atrocious for us to be doing together. In any way, if in an executive session, fine, but not in a public way, and particularly not in in neither place.
Well, point of information, that's not what I was saying. What I was asking was that if all of us are starting to go to the city manager individually, we are in a way directing him individually. We have to have a way to do this as a body to go ahead and make sure that we are all aware of what concerns other council members are bringing to the city manager.
Okay. Any other, Councilmember Wink?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you to our city attorney for giving us some more information behind this. I'm still in favor of the language as it's printed here under personnel matters.
Okay. I think we have consensus to move forward with personnel matters. And some of these other things we're going to have to address as they come up, because we can't sit here and because things come up and then we have to. Yep. So, okay. Thank you. We will move on to the next.
Do we have a next?
All right, maybe this is more foreshadowing for the next time we discuss it.
Page 13.
A few items, and I'll point out one of these is the role of the chairperson. So Mayor Pro Tem Russell brings up a good point that you're agreeing to a general set of rules in your policy manual, and then ultimately the chairperson is responsible for making rulings on what is in your policy manual, and there's procedures in there for disagreeing with the chair's ruling. So that's one item that was asked to cover again. Off agenda items, you had a robust discussion about this once before. It was asked to come back. So I know that we've had some of our lengthiest discussions at recent council meetings on items that aren't noticed on the agenda, or more information other than just a member of the public is coming to speak about it. So that's one thing that you all do need to discuss and decide what your policy is. Does it count that the member of the public is requesting to speak on a topic, and that topic's not on your business agenda, does that count as an off-agenda topic that you need to set for a future meeting, or does that count for a topic that's on your agenda that evening? I think that's a discussion that you need to have. In addition, clarifying your response to public comment and setting forth a procedure for setting future items. To remind you on off-agenda items, in your current draft manual, we did attempt to address this, page 13 and 14, which suggests that there's a majority vote to bring any off-agenda topic that's raised to place on a future meeting agenda. So that's a lot to unpack, and I know we're not going to do that in 5 minutes.
Okay, so that is, we already did, I know we discussed this, and there were some questions that I had about some of the comments, and I don't really want to, I want to end at 5 till 7, so we have 5 minutes before. But it has been addressed in page 13 and 14 of the one we have, or the one that we're working on?
The one that you have, we
Okay.
do have a paragraph on off-agenda topics.
Okay, so we could start here the next time.
Yep.
Correct? Okay. Why
Happy to do that.
Why don't we do that? So, all right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And so we will adjourn and resume next door at 7 o'clock.
Right on time.
Yeah, thank you.